The officers thought they were handling a threat. Parents thought their children were in danger. And the old man sitting on that bench, he thought the world had already forgotten him. But when a certain name was spoken, everything shifted. The crowd, the command, the meaning of obedience itself. Keep watching, because the secret buried in that park will break your heart wide open. Like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you'd have done if you were there. Attack! The command split the quiet afternoon like a crack of thunder. Conversations died, swings stopped mid-arc, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The German Shepherd tensed paws, digging into the dirt, waiting for that spark of instinct that usually followed an order like that. But nothing came. He didn't move. His handler, Officer Denton, tightened the leash and barked again, louder this time. "Rook, attack!" The shepherd's ears twitched, his eyes fixed on the man sitting alone at the park bench, a black man, gray in his beard, shoulders slumped beneath a faded army green jacket. His hands shook around a weather-worn duffel bag, fingers gripping the strap as though it were the only thing anchoring him to the earth. Parents near the playground froze, pulling their children close. The old man didn't look dangerous. He looked exhausted, his face shadowed with both age and sorrow. The call had come in 10 minutes earlier. Suspicious man near the swings, possibly armed. Officers had responded immediately, hearts already half primed for confrontation. Now, standing 20 feet away, they watched him with wary eyes, waiting for a reason to justify their fear. "Sir, stand up," Denton ordered, hand hovering near his weapon. The man didn't. His eyes lifted slowly, and his voice, low and cracked, came out like sandpaper against stone. "Please, son, there's no trouble here." One of the younger officers shifted uneasily, glancing toward the kids now being ushered from the park. "We just need to see what's in the bag, sir," he said, softer. The man tried to rise, but his knee buckled, forcing him back onto the bench. "It's just memories," he muttered, voice barely more than a whisper. "That's all that's left." The tension thickened. Denton's tone hardened. "Back up," he said into his radio. Within minutes, a patrol SUV rolled onto the grass, its tires crunching gravel. The back door opened, and Rook, the department's prized K9, leapt down, a picture of control, every movement sharp-trained, deadly. The dog's breath steamed in the cool air. He waited for his signal, eyes locked on the seated man. "You've had your warnings," Denton called out, hand gripping the leash. "Show us the bag." The man blinked, the corners of his mouth trembling as if he were about to speak, but no words came. Instead, he slowly bent forward and set the duffel on the ground between his boots. His hands stayed hovering above it, palms open, almost as if he were afraid to let go. The younger officer frowned. Something about the scene didn't add up. The old man's movements weren't defiant. They were fragile, uncertain, like someone caught between remembering and forgetting. "Last chance," Denton barked. The shepherd's muscles rippled, tail rigid. "K9, go." The leash went slack. Rook exploded forward 12 strides, 30 feet of raw precision. The crowd gasped, someone screamed, and a toddler began to cry. But just before impact, Rook stopped. Dust flew beneath his paws as he skidded to a halt, his tail lowered. His body, moments ago, an instrument of obedience, trembled. A low, strange sound came from his throat, not a growl, but something softer, sadder. Denton blinked, confused. "Rook," he shouted, "finish it!" But the dog didn't move. His head tilted slightly as he studied the man who hadn't flinched or run. The old veteran just sat there, breathing heavily, staring back through eyes that carried decades of silence. Then quietly, the man whispered, "Rook." The name was small, almost lost to the wind, but the effect was instant. The dog froze again, ears twitching. Denton frowned, pulling the leash. Rook resisted. The man's voice quivered but grew stronger. "Rook, it's me." His hand trembled as he reached out, not fearful, not desperate, just certain. "It's Elias." The name hung between them, invisible but heavy. Rook whimpered a sound of deep recognition. He stepped forward, slow, cautious. The leash tightened, but the handler couldn't stop him. The dog leaned in nose, brushing the man's scarred fingers, breathing him in as if trying to piece together a memory buried too long. Denton's face went pale. "What the hell?" he muttered. One of the other officers lowered his weapon, instinct giving way to awe. The man's eyes filled with tears. "They told me you were gone," he said softly, voice shaking. "They said no one made it out." The dog whimpered again, then pressed his head against Elias's knees, the tension in his body melting into something unguarded and painfully human. For a long moment, the entire park stood frozen. The children had stopped crying. The air at Riverside Park hung heavy after Rook's unexpected disobedience. The crowd that had gathered didn't dare speak, and even the children, sensing the gravity of what they'd seen, clung silently to their parents. Officer Denton's radio hissed to life, but he didn't respond. His hand still gripping Rook's leash trembled faintly. The shepherd stood firm, pressed against the old man's knees, tail twitching low. No one moved. Finally, Denton's partner, Officer Maddox, took a cautious step forward, gun still drawn. "Sir," he said, his voice tight, "I'm going to need you to step back from the dog." Elias Thorne looked up, blinking through tears. "He's not just a dog," he said, his voice raw. "He's mine." The words struck something deep, but the officers were trained to see risk first, reason second. Maddox signaled to another officer to approach from behind. "We're just going to take a look in that bag," he said carefully, as though speaking to a man holding a live grenade. Elias's fingers twitched toward the duffel, hesitation and fear mixing in his eyes. "There's nothing dangerous," he murmured. Denton's patience cracked. "Then open it," he barked. The veteran slowly leaned forward, his joints creaking like old hinges. With trembling hands, he pulled the zipper. The sound was small, but loud enough to cut through the silence. Every officer tensed, eyes narrowing. Inside lay no weapons, no contraband, no threat, just a folded uniform, its color dulled by time and dust. A pair of worn military gloves, and a photograph face down at the top. Maddox ordered, "Turn it over." Elias hesitated, then gently flipped it. The picture showed a younger version of himself, back straight smile, small but proud, kneeling beside a German shepherd in military harness. The edges were creased, the surface scratched, but the details were unmistakable. The nameplate on the dog's vest read Rook. Maddox's throat went dry. He crouched closer, taking the photo in one gloved hand. "Sir," he said quietly, "this is..." His words trailed off as he looked from the picture to the dog, now resting obediently at Elias's feet. "This is him," he whispered. "This is Rook." Denton's jaw tightened, confusion bleeding into disbelief. "That's impossible," he muttered. "This K9 came through our unit 3 years ago." Maddox didn't answer. He was too busy staring at Elias's trembling hands still resting on the photo like it was sacred scripture. "I trained him," Elias said, his tone steady now, the trembling gone. "Back when he was barely more than a pup. We served together." He touched his temple where a faint scar caught the sunlight. "Then there was the blast. They said he didn't make it." Denton's radio crackled again in dispatch, asking for an update. He pressed the mic to his shoulder. "Stand by," he said, curtly, eyes fixed on the pair before him. Something about this scene didn't fit the protocol anymore. Rook wasn't acting out of defiance. He was protecting something familiar. Maddox stood lowering his gun completely. "Let's get ID confirmation," he said. Denton nodded stiffly, though his eyes never left the dog. "Copy that." He called in Rook's microchip ID and asked for background on both. The seconds stretched thin as static filled the air. Then came the dispatcher's voice, confirming K9 Rook, formerly assigned to U.S. Army K9 Division Handler, Sergeant Elias Thorne. Handler listed missing, presumed deceased, Afghanistan 6 years prior. The park went silent again. Maddox turned to Elias, his expression caught between awe and guilt. "Sir," he said, his voice gentler now, "you're supposed to be dead." Elias gave a soft, humorless laugh. "I've been told that before." His eyes flicked to Rook. Seems he didn't believe it either. Denton exhaled, lowering the radio. His tone softened in spite of himself. "How did you end up here?" The man sighed. "I came back with holes in my head, memories gone, records lost. The system didn't know my name anymore." His hand found Rook's neck fingers sinking into the familiar fur. "I've been walking ever since, just trying to remember where I belonged." The handler looked down, speechless. This wasn't a threat. This was a reunion written by fate. The crowd, which had been holding its collective breath, began to murmur softly. Someone whispered, "He's his soldier." Someone else said, "That dog knew." Maddox straightened, glancing around. Cameras were up now, strangers recording what no one would ever believe without proof. He turned back to Denton. "What do we do?" Denton didn't answer right away. His eyes were on the shepherd, who had laid his head fully across Elias's lap. Eyes closed, chest rising slow and steady. "We wait," he said, finally. "We let this play out." A small breeze drifted across the park, rustling the grass and stirring a few stray leaves at their feet. Elias brushed the dust off the photo and slipped it back into his bag. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," he said quietly. The crowd at Riverside Park had swelled the faint buzz of phone cameras and murmured disbelief filling the air as the scene shifted from a standoff to something unexplainable. Officers stood frozen in disbelief as Rook remained pressed to Elias Thorne's side, the once feared veteran now sitting cross-legged in the grass, one hand resting protectively on the dog's neck. Officer Denton's radio crackled again, louder, this time breaking through the stunned quiet. "Unit 14 report. Contain the suspect and secure the K-9, came the voice of the watch commander, sharp and authoritative. The word suspect landed wrong in Denton's ears. He looked down at Elias, who wasn't resisting, or running, just existing, fragile and tired the way a man looks when the world has taken too much. Rook's head rested in his lap, eyes closed, tail sweeping the grass in slow, rhythmic motions. Denton's throat tightened as he lifted his mic. "Copy that," he replied automatically, though his hands hesitated. Maddox glanced at him. "You're not really going to..." Denton cut him off. "I have orders." He approached cautiously, one hand gripping Rook's leash, the other reaching for his restraint collar. "Easy, boy," he murmured, but his voice lacked conviction. Elias looked up, calm despite the tension creeping back into the air. "Don't," he said quietly. "You'll just confuse him. He doesn't understand your orders anymore." Denton froze, every muscle caught between duty and doubt. "He's a service dog," he said. "He responds to protocol." Elias gave a faint, weary smile. "No, he responds to heart." The words shouldn't have carried power, but they did. The crowd around them seemed to hush again. Denton tightened the leash, preparing to pull Rook away. "Heel," he commanded sharply. The shepherd didn't move. His head lifted slightly, eyes flicking toward Denton, but he didn't stand. Instead, he pressed closer to Elias, a low rumble forming deep in his chest, not aggressive, but protective. The handler's brow furrowed. "Rook, stand down," he ordered again, more forceful this time. The dog's tail lowered, his body tensed, and then his gaze softened back toward Elias, who had begun whispering something under his breath. Short, clipped syllables like commands spoken in a memory, too old for anyone else to understand. "Stay low, sweep right," Elias murmured. "Wait for my mark." The phrases weren't random. They were the same tactical cues they'd used during combat drills years ago. Rook's ears perked with recognition. Maddox took a step back, whispering, "He's responding to him, like muscle memory." Denton swallowed hard. "Rook, come," he barked. But the dog didn't. Instead, he moved closer to Elias, pressing his shoulder against the man's chest with quiet insistence. Denton tugged hard on the leash, but Rook resisted, muscles locking, paws planted. The tension snapped like wire. The handler stumbled back a half step, startled not by the resistance itself, but by the intelligence behind it. This wasn't defiance. This was a choice. Maddox raised his palm slightly. "Denton, stop. You'll just escalate it." Denton's voice trembled. "He's not supposed to choose like this. Elias, still stroking Rook's fur, looked up at the officer with quiet understanding. "He's not choosing against you," he said softly. "He's choosing for me." The words hung heavy in the air. The crowd, sensing something deeply human beneath the uniforms and procedure, grew silent again. Then from the radio, still clipped to Denton's vest, came another command, colder and louder. "Unit 14, detain the man immediately. Use non-lethal force if necessary. Retrieve the K9 for evaluation." Maddox's face hardened. "Sir," he said into his own radio, "this situation's under control." The reply came quick. "That wasn't a suggestion, officer. Secure them both. Now." Denton cursed under his breath, torn. He reached for the cuffs on his belt, stepping closer to Elias. "I'm sorry," he muttered, though his tone betrayed conflict more than authority. Elias didn't move away. He simply said, "Son, you can't restrain what was never wild." Before Denton could respond, Rook shifted abruptly, standing between them, body rigid, tail high. His low growl vibrated through the ground. Maddox's hand went to his holster instinctively. "Whoa, easy, easy," he said quickly. Denton froze. "Rook," he called, "stand down." The shepherd didn't. His gaze stayed fixed, protective, every ounce of his training, rewired by something primal and unshakable. For a long second, no one breathed. Then Elias placed a calm hand on Rook's back and whispered, "At ease, soldier." The effect was immediate. The dog's body relaxed, tension dissolving into a low, weary whine. He turned slightly, pressing his head into Elias's side again, like a soldier retreating from a battlefield he didn't want to fight on. Denton exhaled shakily. The leash dangled uselessly between his fingers. Maddox looked at him, expression unreadable. "You heard the order," he said quietly. Denton nodded, his voice hollow. "Yeah," he said. "I just didn't hear it from the right person." He unclipped the leash from Rook's collar. The tension that had swallowed Riverside Park began to unravel into something else entirely. Officer Denton stood, frozen leash still dangling from his hand, the nylon strap brushing against the grass like a quiet surrender. The air felt different now, not charged with danger, but heavy with realization. Rook sat close to Elias Thorne, the old black veteran whose name the system had erased, but whose bond with this animal refused to die. The sun dipped slightly behind a cloud, the light softening as if nature itself were pausing to watch. Maddox knelt beside Denton and muttered, "We need to call this in before someone else does." Denton shook his head slowly, eyes never leaving Elias and the dog. "They wouldn't believe it if we did." Around them, a few brave bystanders began to inch closer, phones raised. One woman whispered, "That dog knows him. Look at that." Her voice trembled with awe more than fear. A teenager near the playground started recording, the lens shaking in his hands. Elias stroked Rook's fur with deliberate care, his touch slow and reverent, as if confirming the dog's existence was no longer a dream. "You remember me, don't you, soldier?" he said softly. The shepherd lifted his head, ears twitching, and let out a low, broken huff that sounded dangerously close to a sob. The sound pierced through the quiet. Denton flinched. He had heard hundreds of K9s bark, growl, or bite, but never mourn. Elias leaned closer, whispering words meant only for the dog's ears. "Echo Delta 7, he said, voice trembling. It was Rook's old military command identifier, the one only his original handler would know. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Rook froze, his body locking as if the word had cracked open a vault inside his mind. His ears went rigid, his eyes widened, and a small whine escaped him before morphing into a series of short, deliberate barks, pattern-controlled exactly as he had been trained to do in service. Elias's face crumpled as tears filled his eyes. "That's it," he whispered. "You still know it. You still know me." Rook lunged forward suddenly, not in aggression, but desperation, pushing his head against Elias's chest. The impact made the old man stagger, clutching the dog's shoulders, as if afraid he might vanish again. The crowd gasped collectively. Maddox stepped back, muttering he answered a code that hasn't been used since the war. Denton felt something deep in his chest loosen. The world had shifted. Regulations no longer applied to this moment. Around them, phones captured everything: the trembling reunion, the human tears, the animals' trembling devotion. A man in a red baseball cap near the swings whispered, "This isn't about police or orders anymore. This is history." The teenager live streaming whispered to his screen, "Guys, I think this old vet just found his military K9 after 6 years." He said some code word, and the dog remembered. Thousands began to tune in within minutes, though no one there yet realized it. For now, it was still just a moment between two souls that had once depended on each other to stay alive. Elias pressed his forehead against Rook's. "You found me," he murmured, "after everything." Rook made a sound halfway between a growl and a cry, the kind that pulled at every heart in earshot. Even Maddox, who'd been trained to detach from emotion, wiped his eyes discreetly. Denton exhaled slowly, speaking under his breath. "You ever seen anything like this?" Maddox shook his head. "Never. And I don't think anyone ever will again." The radio crackled again with the dispatcher's voice. "Unit 14 report status," but Denton didn't answer. Instead, he turned down the volume. The park didn't need commands anymore. They needed silence to understand what they were witnessing. Elias drew in a deep breath, and for the first time his voice regained strength. "Rook heel." The shepherd obeyed, instantly moving beside him, posture straight and alert. "Sit," Elias said next, and the dog dropped obediently at his feet. "Stay." The command was answered with stillness so perfect it felt rehearsed. The crowd erupted in quiet disbelief. Maddox looked at Denton. He just gave him military cues, and the dog responded like he never stopped training. Denton rubbed his forehead. "That's muscle memory. That's love memory," the teenager with the live stream whispered into his phone. He called him by his full name, Echo Delta 7. That's his real service call sign. Oh my God, this is real. His audience ballooned from a handful to thousands, the comment feed exploding with heart emojis, salute emojis, and prayers for both man and dog. Elias didn't know any of that yet. All he knew was the warmth beneath his hand, the steady rhythm of Rook's breathing, and the flood of memories crashing through him. He saw flashes of desert light, heard the thunder of distant mortars, felt the weight of a dog pressed against his leg during the long nights when explosions lit the sky like lightning. He remembered the moment of the blast, the shockwave, the ringing silence, the instant when everything went dark, and he thought both of them had died. His throat tightened. "They told me you didn't make it," he whispered, "but you did. You just had to wait for me to remember." Rook let out a soft huff as if answering him. The crowd watched through tears. Denton lowered himself slowly to one knee, resting the leash across his lap, a quiet symbol of surrender. "Whatever happens next," he said softly to Maddox, "this isn't ours to control anymore." Maddox nodded, scanning the bystanders. "It's too late anyway. People are streaming this everywhere. The department's going to see it before we even file the report." Elias looked up, confused. "Streaming?" The teenager stammered, "Sir, people are watching this online. Like, right now, a lot of people." The old man smiled faintly. "Good. Maybe they'll see something worth remembering." Behind him, Rook shifted, glancing around with an alertness that was no longer fear. It was guardianship. He leaned into Elias's leg again, quiet but resolute. For the first time in 6 years, he was back where he belonged. Denton rose, turning toward the small crowd. "Folks," he said, voice steady, "this isn't a standoff anymore. It's a reunion. Let's give them space." People nodded, stepping back. The tension dissolved completely. The late afternoon light at Riverside Park turned gold as the crowd watched in reverent silence, and for a moment, it seemed like the world itself was holding its breath to make space for the man and dog at its center. The live stream had grown beyond anyone's imagination comments, and hearts flooding in as strangers across the country watched an old black veteran sitting in the grass with the K9 who refused to leave his side. Officer Denton's radio buzzed, pulling him reluctantly from the trance that had settled over the park. Unit 14, report. What is your status? We have multiple incoming calls referencing a viral video from your location. His fingers twitched toward the mic, but didn't lift it. Maddox glanced at him with a look that blended resignation and disbelief. They're seeing it already, Maddox murmured. We can't hide this now. Denton exhaled slowly. I know. He pressed the mic voice low. Dispatch, this is Unit 14. Situation under control. We have positive ID on the individual and possible military background. Request verification from Department of Defense records. A pause followed, and then a different voice, a supervisor this time, came through heavy with concern. Say again, 14. Did you say Thorne? As in Sergeant Elias Thorne, Denton froze. Affirmative. The line crackled, then silence. Maddox frowned. What's wrong? Denton's gaze drifted toward Elias and Rook. They know the name. The radio crackled again, the voice now more composed but slower deliberate. Sergeant Elias Thorne was declared deceased following the Ghazni base explosion 6 years ago. His handler ID and K9 serial were both listed in the same casualty report. There's no record of any survivors from that blast. Maddox swallowed hard. Then how the hell is he sitting here? Denton didn't answer. He didn't have one. The officers exchanged a look that said everything their training couldn't explain. Beside them, Elias was gently scratching Rook behind the ear, oblivious to the bureaucratic chaos his reappearance had just ignited. His posture was calm, but his voice, when he finally spoke, carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent years fighting to be seen. I tried to tell them I was alive, he said quietly. But no one believed me. I didn't even remember my name for the first year. Papers got lost, systems changed, people moved on. Eventually, I stopped trying. Denton knelt in front of him, meeting his gaze. They said you were dead, Sergeant. Elias gave a faint, crooked smile. Wouldn't be the first time the system buried someone still breathing. The irony landed heavy between them. Rook nudged his arm, sensing the weight of his tone. He made it. Though Elias added softly, looking down at the dog. He always listened better than I did. From the phone screen surrounding them, a flood of comments poured in, people demanding answers. Veterans writing that they remembered the Ghazni explosion. Old unit members tagging each other saying, "It's him. He's alive." Across the city, in a small apartment filled with old military plaques, a retired lieutenant named Carl Brewer watched the live stream with trembling hands. He had served under Thorne during their final deployment. The sight of the man once thought lost made his voice shake as he grabbed his phone and called the number still saved from years of service. "This is Lieutenant Brewer," he said urgently. "That man in your video, Sergeant Elias Thorne, he's one of ours. I was there when they called his unit dead. He survived. I need to speak to whoever's in charge of that scene." The dispatcher, already overwhelmed with calls, patched him through. Minutes later, Denton's radio crackled again. "Unit 14, this is command. We've just been contacted by a retired Army officer confirming the individual's service record. Please stand by for verification protocol. Federal military records are being reopened as we speak." Maddox rubbed the back of his neck. "This is turning into something bigger than us." Denton nodded slowly. "It already is." Elias overheard his brow furrowing. "Bigger than us," Denton looked at him. "Sir, you're about to become the headline of the year." Elias's shoulders sank. "I never wanted that. I just wanted a quiet place to sit with what I had left." The quiet was broken again by Rook's soft whine, as if understanding that their peace was being traded for exposure. Around them, the park had transformed into an audience, neighbors, strangers, joggers, parents, all bound by the same disbelief. The line between spectator and participant had blurred completely. Denton's earpiece chirped again. "We have confirmation," came the voice of the watch commander. "Sergeant Elias Thorne, age 58, formerly of the 32nd K9 Tactical Unit, officially listed MIA since 2019. Case is being reopened under federal review. Stand by for arrival of local military liaison." Maddox looked at Denton. "So it's real?" Denton nodded. It's real. Elias stared at the ground for a moment, then lifted his eyes toward Rook. They said you were gone too, he said softly. But they found you, didn't they? You made it back. He smiled faintly. Guess we both did. Rook wagged his tail once slow but deliberate. The moment was intimate quiet, but it carried the power of something far larger, an invisible wound finally recognized. The radio buzzed again, but this time the tone was different, respectful. Unit 14. The department has been notified that military command is sending representatives. You are to remain on scene and maintain custody for both man and animal until arrival. Denton turned down the volume. Custody, he muttered bitterly. They call it custody, but it feels more like captivity. Maddox shrugged. They're scared of what they don't understand. The sound of distant sirens began to rise, not urgent, but official, like an approaching tide of consequence. Elias's fingers tightened on Rook's fur. Are they coming for him? He asked quietly. Denton hesitated before answering. They're coming for both of you, sir. Elias nodded slowly, a calm resignation crossing his face. Then I'll be here. I'm done running. Maddox crouched beside Rook, looking at the dog with something like admiration. You know he never disobeyed a command before today, he said softly. The flashing lights from the arriving vehicles painted the edges of Riverside Park in blue and red, throwing long shadows across the grass where Elias Thorne and Rook still sat together. The once quiet park now buzzed with radio chatter, camera clicks, and the controlled urgency of official procedure. The officers who had been there from the start stood in a loose half circle, no longer enforcing distance but guarding a sacred space. The air smelled faintly of summer dust and rain that hadn't yet fallen. Denton watched the new arrivals, men in plain suits and others in dress uniforms, step out with folders and devices, their posture stiff, their eyes scanning everything except the human truth right in front of them. Rook sensed it first. His ears lifted, body-tensing eyes narrowing at the unfamiliar figures. His tail went still. Elias placed a calming hand on his shoulder, whispering, "Easy, boy. They're just here to watch." But the shepherd's instincts didn't relax. The lead official, a tall man with silver hair and a nameplate that read Colonel R. Vaughn, approached with a calculated calm. Sergeant Thorne, he began, his tone formal but cautious. I'm here on behalf of the Defense Personnel Recovery Office. We've been informed that you were identified earlier this afternoon. We need to confirm certain details before any public statement can be made. Elias met his gaze evenly. You had 6 years to find me, Colonel. What do you need to confirm? The Colonel hesitated. We had no record of your survival until today. His eyes flicked to Rook, and that animal was reassigned to local enforcement after rehabilitation. He's government property. The moment the word property left his lips, Rook's body went rigid. The low rumble from his chest vibrated through the ground. Denton stepped forward, quickly, palm raised. Sir, I wouldn't. But before he could finish, Rook moved between Elias and the Colonel, head lowered, stance wide. He didn't bark, he didn't lunge. He simply stood like a wall made of muscle and memory, daring anyone to cross. Vaughn stopped mid-step. Control your animal, he ordered sharply. Elias's hand stayed on Rook's neck, his voice quiet but strong. He's not my animal, he said. He's my partner. The Colonel's jaw tightened. We have protocols, Sergeant. Elias looked up at him, his expression weathered but resolute. And I have history. Rook glanced back at him, then forward again, unwavering. Cameras flashed as the crowd began to murmur, sensing that something bigger than authority was happening. One young woman holding her phone to record whispered, "He's protecting him from the military. He knows." The livestream's viewer count doubled again, comments exploding with messages like, "You tell them, soldier." And that's not property, that's family. The Colonel cleared his throat, lowering his tone. Sergeant, you have to understand, this is delicate. We need to take custody of the dog for evaluation. Elias shook his head. No, sir, you don't. He turned his gaze toward Rook, speaking softly, but with the command of a soldier who'd once led men through fire. At ease, Echo Delta 7. Rook obeyed, instantly lowering his head, but not moving away. Vaughn blinked, astonished. "He still responds to your code name," he said. "After 6 years," Elias nodded. "Because I never stopped being his," Maddox, standing nearby, whispered under his breath. "You can't train loyalty like that." A young journalist from a local news channel pushed her way through the onlookers' camera crew in tow. She crouched down beside Elias, her voice gentle. "Sir, can you tell us what happened that day, how you lost him?" Denton moved to block her, but Elias gestured for her to stay. "It's all right," he said softly. "People should know." He took a long breath, his eyes' distant voice trembling slightly as old ghosts clawed their way back to the surface. It was a night patrol outside Ghazni. We'd been clearing buildings after a supply convoy went missing. Rook found an IED buried under a truck chassis, but before we could disarm it, a second device went off nearby. I remember the blast, then nothing. When I came to, it was dark, and I couldn't hear anything except his barking. I crawled toward him, but then another explosion hit. The ground gave way. I thought we both died there. He stopped, his breath catching. When I woke up weeks later, they told me everyone was gone. I believed them because it was easier than a fight in a system that didn't remember my name. The reporter's eyes glistened. And today, after all that time, he remembered you. Elias smiled, faintly looking down at Rook. He remembered what mattered. Maybe that's what kept us both alive. The live stream chat filled with prayers, hearts, and words like faith, honor, and homecoming. Vaughn, standing a few feet away, removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair. His tone softened. "Sergeant Thorne, if what you're saying is accurate, then you've just rewritten part of our operational history." Elias chuckled softly, the sound dry but kind. "Guess I'm good at messing up paperwork." The colonel's composure cracked into a reluctant smile. "You understand this will be everywhere by tonight." Elias nodded. "Let it be. Maybe someone else lost in your files will finally be found." Denton knelt beside them, placing the detached leash gently on the grass. "For what it's worth, sir," he said quietly, "you've given a lot of people hope today." Rook turned his head toward him, tail wagging faintly, as if recognizing a friend. Maddox added, "And maybe you reminded the rest of us why we joined in the first place." Elias looked around at the circle of uniforms, the strangers with cameras, the children now unafraid to watch. His voice dropped, carrying across the park. "It's not the medals or the oaths that matter. It's remembering who you stand beside when the smoke clears." Rook leaned into him again, his weight solid and familiar. Night had fallen over Riverside Park by the time the last of the military vehicles left, and the crowd, reluctant to disperse, stayed behind in clusters of quiet disbelief. The air carried that strange stillness that comes after witnessing something sacred. Elias Thorne sat in the grass beneath a street lamp, his back leaning against Rook's side. The German shepherd's steady breathing, a reminder that the world for once had chosen mercy. Officer Denton lingered nearby, making sure no one disturbed them. Maddox stood by the patrol SUV answering questions from late-arriving reporters who couldn't believe the story was real. But the proof was everywhere, on every phone, every feed, every screen glowing across the city. By midnight, the live stream had reached over 6 million views. The headline under every replay read, "K9 refuses order reunites with long-lost handler declared dead." It spread like wildfire. People who had never worn a uniform or held a leash were suddenly writing messages about loyalty, memory, and the quiet dignity of those who serve. Veterans organizations called it a miracle. News anchors called it the story of the year. But to Elias, it was something simpler, something human. "We just found each other," he murmured to Rook as the dog shifted beside him, resting his head across his lap. "That's all." Rook's tail brushed the ground in answer. Denton watched them from a distance, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Maddox approached quietly. "They're not going to sleep much tonight," he said. Denton nodded. Neither am I. He looked at the old veteran under the lamplight, the silver of his beard catching the glow, and he realized this was no longer about orders or headlines. It was about faith, the kind that survives neglect. They said the department's planning a press conference in the morning, Maddox added. City Hall 0900 hours. They want him and the dog there. Denton shook his head. They better handle that right. The world's watching now. Maddox exhaled, pocketing his hands. The world should have been watching 6 years ago. The park slowly emptied as the city's hum replaced the applause, but the footage didn't stop circulating. Overnight, it traveled through every time zone, gathering millions more views. Talk shows debated it. Retired soldiers wrote essays about the unseen cost of war. Hashtags flooded social media, #Echo Delta 7, #Forgotten Soldier, #Rook Remembers. For once, the nation wasn't divided by anger, but united by empathy. By dawn, news vans lined the street outside the small motel where Denton had helped Elias find a room for the night. Reporters waited respectfully, keeping their voices down, aware they weren't chasing scandal, but witnessing something sacred. Inside, Elias sat at the edge of the bed, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. Rook lying across his boots like a guardian. "You ready for all this, boy?" he asked softly. The dog's eyes blinked open and he stretched his paws before resting again. "Yeah," Elias said with a small laugh. "Me neither." At exactly 8:45, a convoy arrived to escort them. Denton and Maddox rode in the lead car, while Elias and Rook sat in the back seat of the second. The streets were lined with people waving small flags, holding signs that read, "Welcome home, Sergeant," and "Heroes never forget." The city had embraced them overnight. At City Hall, the press room was packed. Cameras clicked like rainfall as the pair entered. Elias wore the same jacket he'd been found in its torn sleeve, now pinned with a borrowed medal that a retired soldier had sent overnight through a veterans network. Rook trotted at his side, tail calm, step steady. The mayor took the podium first. Her voice composed but emotional. Sometimes, she began, the greatest stories of courage are not found on the battlefield, but in the moments when love outlasts orders. Today, our city honors Sergeant Elias Thorne and K9 Rook, two soldiers who found their way home to each other. Applause filled the room, but Elias stood humbly, shaking his head. "Ma'am," he said softly. When handed the microphone, we just did what soldiers do. We found a way to survive. His words carried through the silence that followed, hitting deeper than any prepared statement could. Cameras zoomed in on his lined face, the quiet conviction in his eyes. "I didn't come back for medals," he continued. "I came back because something inside me said he was still out there. Maybe that's what faith is, just not giving up on the sound of the one heart that beat beside yours." He looked down at Rook, who lifted his head and pressed his nose gently against Elias's hand. The crowd exhaled together, as though breathing the same air again after holding it too long. Then came the moment no one expected. As reporters called questions, one voice near the front, a young female journalist asked, through tears, "Sergeant, what did it feel like when you realized he still remembered you?" Elias's throat tightened. He knelt beside Rook, resting a hand on his collar. "It felt," he said slowly, "like the world gave me back my soul." Before he could stand, Rook turned toward the reporter, walked to her, and sat directly in front of her camera. He placed one paw on her knee, looking up as if he understood every word she'd said. The room fell silent. She covered her mouth, crying openly, and whispered, "Thank you." The image was captured instantly, a photograph that within hours would circulate across every major outlet, showing Rook comforting a stranger, the symbol of love beyond language. Denton, watching from the back, felt something shift inside him. Something he hadn't known was missing. He whispered to Maddox, "That dog's doing more good than any speech we've ever made." Maddox nodded. "He's doing what we forgot how to." The conference ended with thunderous applause, but Elias didn't bask in it. He simply placed his hand on Rook's head and whispered, "Let's go home." Outside, crowds waited in the sunlight, chanting both their names. Someone had made a large banner reading, "They found each other, and they found us too." Elias walked slowly through the throng, shaking hands, humbled by the weight of their gratitude. Rook moved beside him, his focus never wavering, his ears tuned only to Elias's voice. When they reached the street, Elias paused, overwhelmed. "You see this, boy," he said softly. "You turned fear into faith." Rook gave a small wag, then rested his head against Elias's leg. Cameras flashed again, but Elias wasn't performing. He was simply living a truth too big to hide. That night, the world buzzed with the story of Elias Thorne and Rook the soldier and the shepherd who had shattered every boundary between duty and love. The footage from the press conference was replayed endlessly, the quiet dignity of Elias's words, the moment Rook comforted the reporter, the raw humanity that had cut through bureaucracy and politics alike. Across America, strangers gathered online to call for reform in veteran care animal service policy and recognition for forgotten soldiers. But while the nation celebrated, a colder truth unfolded behind closed doors. In a conference room lined with flags and polished wood, officials from multiple agencies met to decide what would happen next. The defense representative spoke first, his tone clipped and bureaucratic. K9 Rook remains property of the federal government. His reassignment to local law enforcement was temporary and conditional. As of this morning, he's considered active service equipment. Across the table, a police captain frowned. "With all due respect, sir, that dog's more hero than half the humans in this building." The official's gaze was flat. Emotion doesn't rewrite policy. Outside the room, Denton paced the hallway, overhearing fragments through the door. Maddox leaned against the wall, jaw tight. "You think they'll really take him?" Denton's voice was low, but certain. "They're already planning it." Inside, the decision was made with a stroke of a pen. A retrieval team would collect Rook the following afternoon for evaluation and reassignment. That night, Denton couldn't sleep. He drove across town to the modest home where Elias was staying, the porch light glowing faintly against the darkness. Rook was lying near the door, head resting on his paws, eyes half open but alert. Elias opened the door before Denton could knock, as though he'd been expecting him. "You heard, didn't you?" Elias asked quietly. Denton nodded. "They're coming tomorrow." Elias sighed, looking down at Rook. "I guess the system doesn't like to lose what it owns." His hand rested gently on the dog's neck. "He's done serving them. He's done enough." Denton's eyes were tired, but his voice carried conviction. "You're not alone in this, Sergeant. People out there, they're not going to let them do it quietly." The morning sun broke with an uneasy beauty, golden light spilling over the small front yard. By the time the black government SUV appeared, several local reporters were already stationed across the street, along with a growing crowd of neighbors holding signs that read, "Let him stay," and "A soldier's rightful partner." Denton and Maddox stood by the gate, refusing to step aside. The lead agent exited the vehicle, his tone cool and official. "We're here for K9 Unit Rook." Elias stepped out onto the porch. Rook beside him, calm but watchful. "You'll have to go through me," Elias said. "He's not property, he's family." The agent frowned. "Sir, don't make this harder than it needs to be." Elias's expression didn't waver. "You've already made it hard enough." Denton took a step forward. "Before you do this, you might want to check the news feed." The agent hesitated, pulling out his phone. His brow furrowed as he scrolled. Overnight, hundreds of thousands of people had flooded government channels with messages, petitions, and donations, all demanding that Rook remain with Elias. The tag hash "Let Rook Stay" was trending globally, joined by messages from veteran celebrities and even active duty soldiers. The agent looked up, uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Orders are orders," a new voice spoke from behind the crowd. "Not when they're wrong." The people parted as Officer Denton stepped fully forward, now wearing his full uniform badge gleaming in the morning light. Cameras turned toward him instantly. He took a deep breath. "My name is Officer Grant Denton." He began, voice steady but emotional. "I was the handler who gave the order to attack that day in the park. I followed protocol, but that dog Rook, he didn't follow fear. He followed something better. He remembered who he belonged to. And I've realized something since then." He turned to the cameras, his voice rising. "If a dog can recognize the truth when the system can't, maybe the system needs to learn from the dog." The crowd erupted in applause. The agent stood frozen, unable to respond, as Denton continued. "Rook already made his choice, and frankly so have we." He unclipped his own badge and placed it on the hood of the SUV. "If keeping that badge means helping them break a bond that survived war and time, then I don't deserve it." Maddox followed suit, placing his badge beside Denton's. "He belongs home," he said simply. The crowd cheered louder now, the noise spilling across the street like thunder. News drones buzzed overhead, broadcasting the moment live. The federal agents, suddenly surrounded by cameras and public outrage, began speaking into their radios, their confidence cracking. One of them muttered, "Command, we need direction." The response came delayed and hesitant. "Stand down until further notice." The agents retreated to their vehicles under the weight of thousands of watching eyes. Elias stood still, disbelief mixing with relief. "You didn't have to do that," he said softly to Denton. The officer smiled faintly. "Yeah, I did, because someone had to remember who's supposed to protect who." Rook leaned forward, sniffing Denton's hand, then gave a soft, approving bark tail wagging once before settling again beside Elias. Within hours, footage of Denton's speech spread faster than the original reunion. Networks replayed his words on loop, calling it the moment the system stood down. Across the country, people flooded veteran centers and shelters with donations. Petitions reached Congress within a day. That evening, a statement was released from the Department of Defense itself, simple and direct, effective immediately. K9 Rook is retired from all service duties and officially reassigned as a companion to Sergeant Elias Thorne. This decision reflects the highest recognition of loyalty, courage, and bond between Handler and K9. When Elias read it, he didn't smile right away. He just reached down, resting his hand on Rook's collar. "We're free, soldier," he whispered. The shepherd exhaled softly, leaning into him. Denton, standing nearby, watched quietly. "You know," he said, "I've seen men salute generals with less respect than that dog gives you." Elias chuckled, eyes wet. "That's because Rook doesn't salute. He remembers." As dusk settled again over the city, people gathered in the park where it had all begun, candles glowing in their hands. The world moved on from the frenzy faster than anyone expected, but for Elias Thorne and Rook, peace didn't arrive with fanfare. It came quietly weeks later in the form of an offer from the State Veterans Department, a small home inside a care community by the river, surrounded by trees with enough open space for Rook to run. Elias accepted without hesitation. After years of drifting after headlines and interviews and crowds, the idea of stillness felt like the only thing worth chasing. The drive to the new home was calm, no flashing lights, no reporters, just Denton at the wheel and Rook curled on the back seat, his head resting between Elias's hands. They passed through streets painted by autumn leaves scattering in the wind. For the first time, Elias didn't look over his shoulder or count the minutes between stops. When they reached the small community gate, a wooden sign greeted them, "Riverside Veterans Haven, where every battle finds rest." Elias smiled faintly. "Guess they've got a place for lost dogs like us," he said. Rook's ears perked at the word us, and he gave a soft bark that made Denton laugh. "He's already home," Denton said. Elias nodded, though something inside him still held cautious distance from the word. Home had been taken from him once. Trusting it again would take time. The house itself was simple, a small one-story cottage with white paint peeling at the edges, a fenced yard, and a porch that faced the sunrise. Inside, the furniture smelled of lemon polish and fresh sheets. There was even a dog bed waiting near the corner, though Rook ignored it and followed Elias from room to room, his tail brushing the walls. That first night, Elias sat on the porch with a blanket around his shoulders, coffee cooling in his hands. Fireflies blinked across the yard, the faint hum of the river blending with the chirp of crickets. It was the kind of peace he'd once prayed for overseas but never believed he'd earn. Rook lay at his feet, eyes half closed, every bit the soldier off duty. "You did good, boy," Elias whispered. "Better than any man I've known." Rook's tail thumped twice, a steady rhythm against the wood. Over the next days, life settled into a routine. Morning walks along the river, afternoons spent tending the small garden left by the last tenant, evenings reading old letters under the soft lamplight. The staff adored them both. Children from nearby schools visited, leaving homemade cards and dog treats. Rook became the unofficial mascot of the Haven, following other veterans on their walks, keeping silent watch beside wheelchairs and benches. Elias smiled more than he spoke, though some nights his gaze drifted far away back to sand smoke and soundless skies. It was on one of those nights long past midnight that the quiet cracked open. Elias woke in a sweat, heart pounding, lungs gasping as if the blast had just hit again. The room spun. For a moment he wasn't in the cottage, he was back under the collapsed roof of the outpost, choking on dust, screaming for his dog. Rook. The word tore from his throat before he even realized it. The shepherd was already there, paws pressing against the bed frame, eyes bright, tail low, ears back in concern. He gave a sharp whine, then nudged Elias's arm until the trembling stopped. "It's okay," Elias whispered hoarsely, wiping his face. "It's just the noise in my head again." Rook climbed onto the bed, curling against him, the warmth grounding him like it had all those nights overseas. Elias breathed in the familiar scent of the dog's fur earth sun, and something undefinable that always meant safety. "You still remember how to wake me up," he murmured, half smiling. Rook lifted his head and let out a quiet huff, almost as if saying, "Someone has to." The next morning, Elias brewed coffee before sunrise and sat on the porch again, Rook beside him, both watching the mist roll over the river. He looked down at the dog, voice steady this time. "You know, I think you're the reason I came back," he said. "Not just alive, but really back. You kept me anchored to something good." Rook turned his head, meeting his eyes in silence, that same unbreakable understanding that had crossed deserts and battlefields. The days that followed were lighter. Elias started teaching basic obedience classes for other dogs at the Haven, his voice finding strength again through command and laughter. Rook, patient and wise, helped train the newer therapy dogs, his calm presence, teaching them what words could not. Sometimes Elias would stand in the yard watching him and think about how strange it was that something so loyal could come from a world built on orders. Rook's loyalty was different. It wasn't trained, it was chosen. Denton visited often, sometimes in uniform, sometimes not. They'd sit together in the yard, talking about nothing and everything. "You know," Denton said one afternoon, they put up a plaque in the park where it all happened, called it Thorn Field. Elias chuckled. "Figures. That place scared half the city for an afternoon, and now it's a landmark." Denton smirked. "It's not about fear anymore. It's about memory. People still leave flowers there." Elias looked out toward the river, his voice soft. Maybe that's what all of this was for, to remind people that remembering someone is its own kind of victory. Rook barked once, breaking the silence, and Denton laughed. He agrees. As weeks turned into months, the noise around them faded. The reporters stopped calling, the headlines moved on, and what remained was life quiet, unremarkable, and beautifully ordinary. Elias learned to cook again, planting tomatoes and mint by the kitchen window. Rook learned to nudge the coffee mug whenever it was time for a break. Each evening they walked to the edge of the river, watching the sun sink behind the hills, the same way they had once watched the horizon for danger. Only now they were watching for peace. One afternoon, Elias received a small package from an unknown sender. Inside was a polished dog tag engraved with the words Echo Delta 7, Faith Beyond Command. Beneath it a note read, "From those who never forgot." The seasons turned gently at Riverside Veterans Haven. Time moved slower there each sunrise, painting the river gold, and each evening folding the sky into quiet blues. The small white cottage became a kind of legend among the staff, a place where visitors often paused to wave at the old black veteran and his loyal shepherd sitting side by side on the porch, always in the same two chairs. The man with his coffee, the dog with his steady gaze. Elias Thorne had aged gracefully. His hands had grown thinner, his beard silver and soft, his voice lower but warmer. He spent his mornings tending to the garden, his afternoons training young therapy dogs, and his evenings reading letters sent from people around the world who said his story had given them courage. The headlines had long since faded, but the memory hadn't. People still came to Riverside just to see him and Rook, to thank them for reminding the country of something simple and sacred. "We're just two old soldiers," Elias would always say with a laugh. "He kept me alive, I just kept the story honest." Rook had slowed down too. His muzzle had turned white and his steps were stiffer, but his eyes never lost their spark. He followed Elias everywhere, from the porch to the riverbank, from the kitchen to the fields, his loyalty as steady as his heartbeat. The two of them had outlasted the noise, the headlines, and the world's short attention span. They didn't need recognition anymore, they had peace. But time, no matter how kind, never forgets to collect its dues. One late autumn night, when the air was sharp and the moon hung low over the water, Elias sat longer than usual on the porch, wrapped in his old army blanket. The house was quiet, save for the creak of the boards beneath Rook's paws. The dog came and rested his head on Elias's knee, eyes closing in rhythm with his breathing. "You still standing guard, huh?" Elias whispered, stroking his fur. "Even after all this time?" Rook gave a faint grunt, the same sound he used to make when waiting for orders. Elias smiled. "No orders left, soldier. Just peace." Inside, the clock ticked past midnight. When the nurse came to check on him the next morning, the coffee on the porch table was still half full, the blanket draped gently over Elias's lap. His face was serene, his hands still resting on Rook's back. He had gone quietly, just as he had lived since finding his way home, without noise, without pity, with a calm that only men who've made peace with their ghosts ever truly know. Rook stayed beside him, unmoving his body, pressed close, his eyes open, but soft. When the sun rose, he lifted his head once, looking toward the river, then lay back down against Elias's chest, and didn't move again. The staff found them like that hours later, two silhouettes framed by morning light, their story coming full circle. News spread slowly at first, then rapidly, as if the world had been waiting to feel that ache again. Newspapers called it the final watch. Commentators said it was proof that loyalty doesn't end with death. But for those who had known them, it wasn't tragedy. It was completion. Denton arrived at the cottage that evening, hat in his hands, tears glinting in his eyes. He sat on the steps for a long time, remembering the park, the leash he'd dropped, and the day he'd learned that orders mean nothing without heart. "You did it, Sergeant," he whispered. "You both did." The following week, the government announced something unprecedented, the creation of the Echo Delta Memorial, a national tribute dedicated to veterans and their service dogs, with Elias Thorne and Rook named as its first honorees. The memorial was built on the same field where the standoff had once taken place. A bronze statue stood at its center. Elias seated on a bench, hand resting on Rook's head, both gazing toward the horizon. At the base were engraved his final words, found in a handwritten note left on his nightstand. "If you ever forget what faith looks like, find it in the eyes that waited for you to come home." On dedication day, thousands gathered. Veterans saluted. Children held flags. Reporters wept openly. The mayor spoke of courage, the colonel spoke of duty, but it was Denton who captured what everyone felt. He didn't just remind us what a good soldier looks like, he said, his voice breaking. He reminded us what a good man looks like, and that the best orders ever given are the ones spoken by the heart. The crowd stood in silence, heads bowed. In the front row, the staff from Riverside Haven held hands, tears shining in the sunlight. Behind them, a group of K9 handlers stood with their dogs, each one raising a paw in unison as a bugler played taps. The notes drifted into the wind, fading softly over the park where it had all begun. That night, candles lined the path leading to the statue, glowing like stars reflected on earth. Strangers who had never met Elias left letters and collars, small medals, and folded flags. They called it the field that remembered. In time, it became a place where people came not just to honor a man and his dog, but to remember something deeper, the power of faith that doesn't waver when orders end. Years passed, and the story became legend, told in classrooms, whispered in barracks, written into history books. They called it the day the dog remembered, though those who had been there knew it was never about memory. It was about love that refused to yield. Somewhere in the quiet, under the bronze gaze of the statue, the wind would sometimes move through the grass in soft, rhythmic waves, and those who listened swore they could hear it. A bark, a laugh, a heartbeat, still beating in time. Denton visited often, leaving coffee on the bench beside the statue. "You earned your rest, Sergeant," he would say, "but you'll never be forgotten." And he was right, for long after their footprints faded from the earth, Elias Thorne and Rook lived on, not in headlines or ceremonies, but in the small, unseen acts of loyalty between humans and the ones who never asked for words to prove love. They lived in every soldier who came home and every dog who waited at the door. They lived in the truth that orders end, but devotion never does. They lived in faith beyond command, the end. If this story moved, you don't forget to like and subscribe for more true stories of loyalty and courage. Tell me in the comments, what part of Elias and Rook's journey hit you the hardest? And where in the world are you watching from your thoughts? Keep these stories alive.